Welcome to the Disruptance Podcast. The Disruptance Podcast is the show that disrupts the way entrepreneurs think to make them more profitable and impactful. Rethink tired and outdated business norms to welcome innovation and unlock your unlimited possibilities. Here are your hosts, Eric Forney and Greg Fowler.
Eric, we're here for another one, my friend. Disruptance Season 2. And this particular topic, as always, as I get excited about every single episode hanging out with you, how to win friends and influence people to grow your business. Now,
This is like going to kindergarten. I feel like we're about ready to unpack Miss Lippy and the little puppy who lost its way. That's what it sounds like. What is it we're talking about?
I love it. Any Happy Gilmore reference is always good in my book, my friend. I thought you were going more Blue's Clues style, but that's okay too. That works. So people are going to get confused on this one, or maybe not. But we aren't talking about this book, but we are at the same time.
Okay.
Really utilizing this into the fundamentals of what's going on. And yes, the title is How to Win Friends and Influence People. But more on a tactical basis for the entrepreneurs or the disruptance nation who's tuning into this, how to really communicate, connect, and convert. I mean, ultimately, we're looking to grow, to scale, to disrupt the way that we think and feel. That's why everybody's here. But to give anybody a background, because Eric, before you and I hit the button, you told me that you've never read this book. And to a man of your stature and caliber to tell me that, it was the coolest thing. I was like, really? So,
yeah, I thought you were getting ready to say, Greg, before we hit the button, my technology failed like 17 times. And I can't figure out how to work a webcam. I'm basically screwed if I have to have a career on OnlyFans. I can't get this webcam and this mic to work consistently. I would absolutely go bankrupt if Andrew Tate was trying to hire me. So it's a good thing that we're going to talk about a book that I haven't read. I've got a much better shot at being able to add some value than work this webcam.
Good man. And don't get the audience excited about your OnlyFans page, Eric. I mean, come on, let's keep it on track here, talking about this. Not as exciting as that, but for anybody who doesn't know, and again, you included, Eric, I think this is really fascinating. Your unique perspective of not, reading the book and not really knowing about it. It's going to really bring your unique knowledge and perspective to the major takeaways. And that's really what we're going to kind of be discussing. But for anybody out there who hasn't, this book is it's from 1936. And it's a self-help book written by Dale Carnegie over
1936.
1936. Wow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I needed a lot of self-help right there during the Great Depression. Needed a lot of self-help. Okay.
There was a lot, and transcending through, the time frames here, over 30 million copies sold worldwide. Wow. It is one of the highest selling books ever on the planet. So if you are an Amazon fan, it is a 4.7 star out of 32,000 reviews.
Wow.
So it's a pretty cool book. I mean, I've read it several times myself. My wife has read it. And first of all, she doesn't read a ton of books. And second of all, not sales or self-help sort of style either. So that kind of says a few things in and of itself that way. It really is a book that I recommend anybody kind of tuning into, or at least this episode of Disruptance, because we're going to go over the main takeaways anyway, and then have some tactical, application to it. So the whole premise of the book, it's not just really, as the title states, but it's to emphasize the importance of showing genuine interest in others, listening actively, and making others feel important and appreciated. That's really what it is. It's about people. It's about communication. And I think ultimately we could all be better at it. So, Eric, I want to just throw these 5 takeaways at you and kind of get your thoughts on them. Like, what comes to mind? Does it make sense? Do you have any real world?
What already comes to mind is that my wife would say I probably need to read the book then, based just on your summary of the book itself, right? I need to be interested, and I need to listen, and so basically what I hear is it's Husband's Guide to the Galaxy. Good.
There you go.
It's a great book.
They should have that on the back. That
right.
should be right there. Husband's Guide to the Galaxy of Women. Men are
right.
from Venus or Mars, and women are from Venus. Yeah, that sort of thing. So here are the 5 takeaways, Eric. I hot takes again. You've never read the book. That was like your first intro to the thing. So this is going to be really cool, man. So the first one for everybody out there, and again, play along too. Like if you're tuning into this, what are your thoughts? What are your perspective? What comes to mind? Does this make sense? Kind of play along with Eric here and myself. So one of the first takeaways, or the first takeaway out of the 5 that I kind of identified, be a good listener, show sincere interest, and encourage others to talk about themselves. So I guess the first thing is be a good listener, show that you're truly interested in someone, and encourage them to talk about themselves more. So what are your thoughts with those 3 kind of components in that first main takeaway?
Is that one bullet? Is that like one?
That's
one heading. Okay.
That's
so
one.
Be a good listener and be interested.
Yep. Show sincere interest and encourage others to talk about themselves.
Okay. I mean, that makes sense to me. It seems pretty timeless. It's fascinating to me that was a best-selling book, right? Because if you just ask me on this free podcast, what I would tell you is feeling heard is second best to having sex. And so, making someone feel heard is probably the second most empowering thing you can do for them. Mm-hmm. So that seems to check the box. The funny part is how difficult it is to apply and practice. I was actually teaching a little bit of it to the team this morning, the nuance between perspective and perception. And the reason why is because understanding that subtle difference between your perspective, the speaker's, your perspective as the listener, and then the perspective of the person who's speaking and presenting, typically a prospect, of course, in the sales world, but it could be an employee from a leadership standpoint as well. Understanding the difference between their perspective and your perspective so that you can get to a place of perception. Okay, there's a subtle nuance between the two. And the nuance is that perspective is basically the body of your life's work and the summation of everything that you've gone through and how that shapes your view of the world, or your lens and filter of how you listen and how you hear. And then perception is real-time processing of inputs. So I perceive that to be a tree. I perceive that tree to have leaves. I perceive that it has bark. It's brown. It has green. Whatever it is, right? I perceive those sensory items. In order to be a good listener, I need to understand the difference between perspective and perception. Mm-hmm. And it starts with first recognizing that I'm listening from my own perspective. If what I find is trying to teach this skill to people in sales can be really difficult because we walk through the world through our own perspective. Right? How could we not? We have 2 eyes that only see our own perspective and have only lived the one life that we know of. And so as a byproduct, what most of the time I find is eventually we default to listening through perspective. The value becomes is when we can separate the two cognitively. Mm-hmm. And that starts with recognizing first that we have we have our own filter of the words that someone uses. Mm-hmm. When we can recognize that we listen through our own filter, then we can be cognizant and conscious about trying then instead to shift towards a perception of what did they actually say? Mm-hmm. And when they said those words, what is their perspective, not what is my perspective. Right. And it is through that process of iteration and evolution through listening that we have the ability to help people become more heard. And what I believe is also help people help ourselves be more curious. And it's that curiosity that creates good conversation or good sales or good leadership, because tie the bow on it. The second most empowering thing you can do outside of sex, which I don't recommend you do with your employees or your prospects, is to make someone feel heard.
Sound advice right there at the tail end, Eric. But I think the way that you're portraying that is beautiful. And again, the adage of putting yourself in their shoes, and I think looking at it from an unfiltered scenario from your thoughts. Somebody says the exact same thing that you say, they're meaning one thing, you're meaning another. And you're focused on your version or variation of that meaning. And ultimately, the best at this really take themselves out of the equation and inject it directly, as you mentioned. And I think that that's a learned skill. It takes time, it takes effort, and you really actually want to be sincere and care about people to have these conversations. And ultimately, that's not necessarily natural for everyone. I think you have to be curious, as you mentioned. I think there's a lot of takeaways just into that one main component, but I know they cover that in depth in here, but the idea behind it is this is something that everyone should just really put to pace. And, really getting others to talk about themselves. Everybody does want to be seen. Everybody does want to be heard. And to your point, there's just a massive amount that people are just so focused on. Let me get out what I need to say. Let me focus on my needs and my wants and not necessarily really care or put them first. Well, try this as an exercise. If you're a person that's having these issues, try to flip it. Put it in perspective and really be that person and see how the conversation goes. It's going to be a lot different than you taking over and really just reeling everything out and then waiting. To me, I think that's a massive thing to think about for sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. I don't think my wife listens, so it's probably safe because, I'll tell her a different story. So we'll just assume that she's not listening, right?
Mine neither, Eric. Mine neither.
Contrary to popular belief, I went on a date once or twice before I got married, and what I realized that going on dates was actually similar to sales. It actually became sales practice. And now now someone who doesn't understand sales is going to be like, oh, gross. That's the worst thing we've heard Eric say. Well, hold tight. Listen to previous episodes. I say way worse shit than that.
There you go.
But what I mean by that is sales done wrong is gross. But sales from the framework of understanding that it is bridging the gap between someone's reality and their desired future, that's effective sales. And funny enough, what I found was that dating can work a lot of the exact same way, which is, what if I just went on a date and then did nothing but ask questions? So, for like 3 or 4 in a row, I would just go and ask questions. And try to not talk at all about myself. Basically, how could I say nothing specific to me? Every question I got asked followed up with another question. It just became a fun game of trying to get better at being curious and asking questions because the stakes were low. It made no difference. Like, what's the worst case scenario? That I went to lunch and that person got a free lunch and they felt heard? Okay.
Yeah.
Nothing harmed. That didn't happen because I, of course, only ever dated my wife. But
well, there you go.
Yeah.
But she's not listening, so
that's right.
You can tell us, Eric. You can tell me.
Right.
We're all friends here.
That's right.
But that again, just that practice and repetition and putting yourself in perspective, I think is huge. It's crucial, massive advice. But let's go to the second takeaway, if you will.
Okay.
And they all almost bleed into one another, and they make sense for cohesion purposes. Give honest and sincere appreciation. People feel valued and important and confident. So making them feel valued, important, making them feel confident. I think that is really kind of a next step. It's so you're going down the line from making sure that you're listening, that you're encouraging, and you want people to talk about themselves. But then the next step is, as they're doing that and you have an opportunity, give honest and sincere appreciation and or feedback in your communication, and continue to make sure that you're making that person feel valued and important and confident. Like, what are your thoughts on providing that into sincere appreciation, making people feel valued?
Listen, it's a great general practice, right? I don't know of a time in which someone, if it's so long as it's genuine, I
Yes.
don't know of a time in which genuine appreciation or gratitude ever goes wrong. Assuming that it's within the bounds of the workplace, and it's interesting because this morning I got a text from, it was a group text. It was from one of the leaders in the company.
Mhm.
And I don't believe that it was intended to be like a compliment or a gratitude text, but that's how I received it.
Mhm.
And it was, like I do a morning training every morning for 20 minutes for our CEOs.
Mhm.
And, I put a ton of time and energy into it. And some days my default belief is that I'm terrible at it. And I mean that in the most healthy way, by the way.
Right.
I don't wake up in shame spiral about whether I'm terrible. It's the belief that I have the ability to be better
Mhm.
that compels me to want to be better every day, because I genuinely believe that I should wake up and respect their time and give them the best product possible for the 20 minutes that they allocate in the morning. And so I operate from the default level of believing that my delivery and the product is subpar or average at best. But I got a text from him today, and he said basically my daughter asked today what Eric's message was going to be this morning. And I was like, oh wow, we're going to give you parent of the year. You're raising your kids right, making them listen to what amounts to be like a daily drive podcast or daily radio segment.
Mhm.
And I was like, it's good to know we have one fan. And then the follow up was like, well, my son actually asked twice this week as well. And
Oh.
that wasn't intended to be like a flattery compliment. I think it was an observation. But I told my wife, I said, that's probably the best message that I've received in I don't know how long. And the reason why was because it was evident of an impact, right? It was evident of creating an impact on a future generation of people who have leadership potential to know that, hey, this is something they're doing as a family,
Mhm.
waking up and getting this message and moving forward every day with that content. And hopefully it's making a positive impact on them. And so, as a leader, the challenge can be is that, especially leaders, you rarely hear a lot of positive feedback. And that's because it's your job typically to solve problems and to remove roadblocks. And so you either have people that kiss your ass for positioning, or you have people that tell you what an ass you are. And you very rarely get that genuine middle ground. And so I just thought it was an interesting example of like real time, how that made me feel, to the point where I went out of my way to tell my wife about it and to, elaborate on it and obviously bring it up here. I will say the one thing I would probably add to that though, Greg, for what it's worth is at a certain point, the more successful you become, the harder it is to get real feedback.
Mhm.
And again, it goes back to some people are kissing your ass for positioning,
Mhm.
and some people just are generally positive, and they would rather say nothing or say something positive.
Mhm.
But I've received feedback from you that's been what I would consider to be strategically critical.
Mhm.
And that's the type of messaging I would prefer to have as a leader, which is, hey, X, Y, and Z was good. Here's how you could get better.
Mhm.
It was, and then something that's like evidence based or tactically based. That's the type of feedback that I think leaders need more than anything.
Mm.
Is people around them who will give them the positive and sandwich it with ways they can improve.
Yeah, but I love that perspective into there, Eric. And again, looking at it from that standpoint, anybody who's tuning into this, and I'm sure that the majority of you are massive leaders in your organizations and really doing big things as entrepreneurs. And what Eric is saying is resonating with you. There's a lot of yes men and women, right, in your life, but there's not a lot of people that are close to you that can tell you exactly the truth and what you need to hear, not necessarily what you want to hear. And I think those relationships are crucial. Coming from a healthy place, from a place of constructive criticism, I think is crucially important. And everything that you're saying makes a ton of sense. I want to rewind back on your earlier, kind of waking up in the morning. And as you said that, I thought Eric Forney waking up in the morning, pissing excellence, just like Ricky Bobby in Talladega Nights. And that's the first, I was like, I thought that's
Yeah.
where you were going, not the other way around. So, it is interesting that we all have that kind of dynamic of self-reflection to be able to apply it out there. The sincerity and the authenticity, though, is the crucial component coming from a good place. I know that if people that are tuning into this right now, they really look at their lives, all the relationships that are in their lives, personal and professional. And if you have it in the back of your mind as you're going through your days, is there an opportunity for me to be authentic in giving feedback to really encourage people? Would that make a difference in their lives? And yes, it would. The feedback that you got made a difference where you repeated it several times and it made you feel a certain type of way. I always look at it into the equation. Like if you're standing in the line at the grocery store and you see somebody wearing some really cool dunks, you're like, hey man, cool dunks. Like it could be as simple as that. Like maybe it's a colorway that you like, and it's going to make that guy feel really cool in the line at the grocery store. You don't know him. He doesn't know you. It leaves from there. But those sort of things really make an impact into somebody's life. You don't know what they're going through. You don't know what their day looks like, but that's a complete stranger. Think about your spouse, think about your kids, think about your team, any admin or organizations. Like those things with sincerity and authenticity can really make a big difference and impact. But to Eric's point, I would also say, onto the side of caution, don't be afraid to show the other side of saying, hey, this is what could be better.
Yeah, I mean, let me just make it super tactical so people I can contextualize it for listeners. Is so, I do that Market Monday on Monday afternoon, and I remember, in an effective way, you're like, hey, it was 9 minutes 32 seconds, but before you did XYZ strategy, it was 34 minutes before ABC strategy. Mix up pacing, cadence, whatever the advice was. It wasn't an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
It was an objectively based perspective. So the only way I can receive it is based on the facts itself.
Mm-hmm.
Is how could I be emotional about the fact that those points were accurate?
Mm-hmm.
And then I have the choice. I can decide to implement it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And if I implement it and it doesn't work, or it's negative, okay, that's fine. The stakes were low. I can unwind it.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality of it is you just said, hey, here's a mirror of facts and information. Process it as you will.
But that's facts based, not taking it personally, ego out of the equation sort of scenario. And whether someone does something with the criticism or, constructive advice or not is there. And, everybody's got somebody in their life that can't help themselves, but just throw an opinion in there, whether it's warranted or asked for or not. And look, hey, we're not talking about that per se, but people
Correct.
that are confidants into your life that you trust, that you respect, there's different knowledge based into that. So I love it. And this kind of tails into the next one here, Eric, which I think is perfect. It's talking about criticism. So in the book, it talks about criticism just the same way, but based off of the right time to give feedback in a negative. So the idea behind it, don't criticize, essentially complain, let other people save face in front of audiences. So when is the right time to let someone know, hey, this is what we see, this is what we've heard? This might be from an employee to employer standpoint, or to a colleague to colleague, even if it ends up being direct to clientele. When is the right time to criticize, and kind of how do you tackle that when you need to have the tough conversation? It's easy to give compliments, man. It's easy to tell people like you're a shining star, like you rocked it, you killed it, awesome stuff. So where are your thoughts into that? Because they dive deep into it too.
Yeah, I disagree. As a child of an engineer, it is not easy to give compliments. It is easy to find criticism. That part's easy.
You and me both. You and me both, Eric. Yeah.
I'm really good at finding things to be critical of. That's the superpower. I won't pretend that I'm good at that. Because again, candidly, I have the ability to ability or inability to find plenty of the things that don't go according to plan or don't go right, and And so, yes, the challenge can be is understanding when do you introduce them. And frankly, I think that's more art than it is science.
Oof.
And the reality of it is there are times in which you should actually criticize in public, and there are times that you should criticize in private. A lot of it depends on your ideal objective as a leader.
Okay.
And I'll give you an example of when I'll criticize in public, because I've been criticized that same way in public. And what you want to do is you want to get the multiplication effect of it as a leader, because you don't need to have that credit. You don't need to be individual with criticism several times. Someone on the phone during a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the difference can be is now how I handle it specifically. How I handle it is probably more passive aggressive.
Okay.
There will be some that'll handle it directly.
Okay.
But for either one can work.
Mm-hmm.
I personally prefer the passive. I would prefer as the receiver my subtle passive aggressive way, but I know that there are others who would prefer the inverse. So
okay.
Someone's on my phone. Someone's on the phone. I might, if Greg, you're on the phone in a meeting, I might say, "Hey, Greg, we can wait on you.
Yep.
Let me know if your wife has any good dinner plans, because I might want to go with us. I might want to go with you." I'm gonna point it out, but I'm gonna try to soften it with something that's humor related, or something that's me not feeling like I'm coming down with a heavy hand. Mm-hmm. But that's just my own preferred style of handling problems. Sure. I prefer to approach them from the framework of you're an adult. Mm. There are some who would just say, "Hey, Greg, could you put your phone away?" And that might be sufficient. Yeah. So the truth of it is there are times when we should be critical in public, and there are times to be critical in private. The reality is it depends on what the desired strategy and the objective is. I would say it's more art than it is science.
And that's a beautiful perspective depending on what's going on. Now, is it also based off the individual, would you say too, Eric? I mean, because some people, I think, would rather appreciate the direct, like, "Hey man, put your phone away. Like, now's not a good time." Or, "Hey, like, what's going on, man? Is your phone blowing up?" And so do you feel that you also have a case by case, not just based off of your comfort and delivery, but how you feel the perception of the individual would take that delivery?
Yeah, I actually don't really care, frankly.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's the right or the wrong answer, but I just don't.
Yep.
And I say I don't only because from a leadership standpoint, the challenge can be is like, when do you remain quasi true to yourself and to the culture of the organization, which is set by behavior. And so then if culture equals behavior, not t-shirts and not slogans and not writing on the wall and catchy catchphrases, but actual collective behavior. If you would prefer to do it and you can uphold it as a leader, then you should follow that style. The challenge can be, as someone who is inherently critical by nature, is what I realize is I can be like Icarus. And what I mean is that internally, I can fly really close to the sun. And if I let that out externally, it sets people on fire, and that does more damage than it does good. So I have to figure out the balance between my internal passion and the external delivery. And sometimes I'll err on the side of not confronting it for the sake of not causing external damage.
Well, and Eric, I know you can't see my notes here, but it's literally dropping straight into the next talking point here, like nice. One of the major takeaways from the book, which again, I don't know. I mean, from all these years ago, it's still resonating from the 1930s, but this is talking about avoiding argument, and not necessarily direct avoidance of argument, but the breakdown of most arguments end with each person more convinced that they are right. So a lot of people would say there's two sides to the equation. The passion that you feel about one thing, somebody could equally feel the passion of the opposite. And when worlds collide, a lot of times you just reinvigorate your passion and understanding, and it doesn't really change based off it. So it doesn't get any better. But at the same time, how do you approach arguments or conflicting beliefs. And now this isn't like a marriage relationship
Yeah,
sort of
no,
thing
that's
here.
okay.
But I think the audience can translate this into relationships under any circumstance, with kids, with spouses, with teams. So I really like this topic. How do you approach differing beliefs and arguing, or spirited conversation, as
Yeah.
some people might say?
It's my love language. Um,
Very good.
so how I approach it is with the encouragement of them. Um, and I, 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 I personally enjoy debating and arguing. And what I say that because I genuinely want to improve. Right. It's like one of my core values is progress and mastery. So as a byproduct of that, it's my belief that you can't obtain mastery and you can't obtain progress without meritocracy of idea and of knowledge. And so, last week I was down, spent a little bit of time with somebody who is very, very accomplished, probably somebody who with a net worth of near $1 billion. And there were some topics that came up about real estate and some of the specifics regarding one person's belief around how the industry works. And, there's a handful of us in a room.
Sure.
And we're discussing business because that's what you do at like 8 p.m. when you're degenerate entrepreneurs like we were. And in this room's a guy, again, who's worth $1 billion. So, on paper, his voice carries the loudest.
Sure.
And yet the reality is like, I have no problem going hard in the paint with him. If his perspective didn't align with mine.
Wow.
And a lot, and I'll give you a real world example. Like I ask a question about a business strategy, got an answer. It piqued this curiosity because of his success, I respect his perspective.
Sure.
And therefore, when we saw the world from a different perspective, what I want to understand is why. Why do I have a different perspective than what he does on the same topic? Both of which, hopefully, we had done some research, and why are our perspectives so different? And the reality is, I hadn't researched and been educated enough on the topic to know, and so it wasn't one that I was going to like hold a ground on in an argument or a debate. What I did do was go back to the hotel room and stay up until 4 a.m. and research that, and then put together a white paper worth of research on that topic to discuss the next day.
Wow.
And that's because for me, I'm interested again in the meritocracy of ideas. I'm not interested in winning. I'm interested in what wins. And so, in our very first episode of season 2, we talked about this concept of thinking from principles. And in my opinion, life exists under a shared set of surviving principles. And those are typically principles like this book, like the Bible, like probably most religious texts that have a high degree of survivability. It's because they're principally based. And therefore, if we're going to argue over whether it's a good idea to compliment someone or not, there is a generally accepted best practice, and the answer is yes, you should. And so I will debate something that is as close to a fact or as close to truth as possible if I'm educated and researched on it. I don't argue about climate change. I don't argue about Middle East politics. I don't argue over nuclear fission and most women's reproductive health. There are a number of things that I won't argue on because I'm not educated and I'm not passionate about them.
Sure.
But those that I'm passionate about and I'm educated on, I am interested in having the debate. Not for the sake of being right, but for finding out what is right.
But that to me is impactful for everybody to really deeply understand, speak to things that you know and are confident in the information. And if there is an opportunity for you to have a spirited debate, have it. And everybody has different delivery. I think I'm curious to kind of how you process those thoughts, Eric. I know there's a lot of people that when they go into a potential opportunity where somebody has conflicting beliefs, Some people go straight and cram all their thoughts down the throat, where others, they hang back and they wait and they gather and they wait and they gather and they wait. And then they finally kind of slam it down based off of seeing the cards tumble. So what's your perspective, or is it different per?
It can be tough. I went with both routes last week, and some of the challenge can be depends a little bit on who your group is. Mm-hmm. So I would prefer to do the like self-discovery method, right? Where you ask questions and you get someone to like self-discover the error in their own thought process. The problem is in a room full of entrepreneurs, you'll rarely have the time. They won't usually, they're too damn impatient and ADHD to give the time to actually ask, 3 follow-up questions. So that could be the challenge, and we'll talk about this on a later episode, but it's a pretty much a waste of your time and money to call old leads in a database. If you're a real estate agent, is statistically just a waste of your time and money. And that is a topic that I debate all the time with people, because that's one where it just like absolutely is a long held core belief of real estate entrepreneurs that somehow, because they paid for numbers from a white pages, that somehow there's an inherent value in those names in white pages. And the reality is they're worthless. And yet it is such a widely held core belief for so many people, because they've been sold propaganda from an industry that survives on agents believing that fairy tale, that's one that takes a while to get people warmed up to understanding and being open-minded to actually believing that the earth is not flat and Santa Claus lives in a mall. And so that one takes a while.
But that to me, Eric, that'll be an incredible episode. There's no doubt. A beautiful segue into kind of wrapping up and putting a bow on this, my friend, because I think that ultimately there's a lot that people can take away from it. I mean, if you haven't read it. Read it. I mean,
should I read it?
It's a quick one.
Should I go read it? Is that what you're telling me?
I mean, you could really take the major takeaways from what we just discussed. Okay. If you want to dive deeper, they have deeper perspective into this, and I think it's pretty good. Let me do some ASMR, some pages for the listeners, just in case you wanted to listen to that. But I think that ultimately, Eric, we summed it up beautifully. I mean, this is just such a great conversation to have, and again, your perspective is so unique into the applied knowledge base. It's cool stuff. Dale Carnegie held up here from the 30s up to Eric Forney and disrupting standards. I'm a fan. I'm good.
Well, I'm planning to ask ChatGPT to give me the cliff notes on the book. And you know what, though? Warren Buffett says it's the best book and the best investment he ever made was in the Dale Carnegie School for Public Speaking. And so, if the wealthiest, most successful investor in history says it was the best investment that he made, it's probably worth the investment. But for me, I'm going with ChatGPT, the top 10 things I need to know.
Good man, Eric. I love it, my friend. Always an awesome time. We'll catch everybody on the next episode of Disruptance. Take care.